let's jump right into this. Today's explainer is diving into a truly fascinating and honestly pretty heavy academic synthesis about how the human mind, subtly and sometimes blatantly, strips the humanity right out of other people. But more importantly, we're going to look at how we can actually repair those fractured relationships. It's an incredibly timely topic, so let's get into the data.
Here is our roadmap for this explainer. 1. The dehumanization spectrum. 2. Perceiving minds and morals. 3. The perpetrator's perspective. 4. Escalation and genocide. 5. Politics and everyday hostility. And finally, 6. Repairing intergroup relations.
Section 1. The dehumanization spectrum.
So, does dehumanization only happen in war? We usually picture those extreme wartime propaganda posters calling enemies bugs or beasts. But actually, scratch that. It's not just overt propaganda. Psychological research like Lyon's theory of infrahumanization reveals this is a much wider spectrum than we'd like to admit. It literally starts with these subtle, totally unconscious biases where we just kind of assume our own group feels deeper, more complex emotions than those outsiders over there.
Nick Haslam's dual model brilliantly illustrates how this works. We've got two sides of the coin here. On the left, there's animalistic dehumanization. That's the classic one, denying people their uniquely human traits like intelligence and self-control, effectively treating them like primitive beasts. But then, on the right, there's mechanistic dehumanization. This is when we deny someone's human nature, their warmth, their emotion. It's treating people like they're just cold robots, corporate cogs, or totally replaceable objects. Both mechanisms strip away humanity, just with different flavors of cruelty.
Moving right along to Section 2, Perceiving Minds and Morals.
Now this is where it gets absolutely crucial. Based on Gray's dimensions of mind perception, our moral concern for someone rests on two major pillars: agency and experience. Agency is all about thinking, planning, and self-control. Experience is the capacity to feel pain and subjectivity. If we mentally strip a group of agency, we stop seeing them as responsible moral agents. We treat them more like animals. But if we strip them of experience, we literally shut off our own empathy because, well, if they're just like robots, they can't suffer, right? It's a psychological trick with profound real-world consequences.
Section 3. The perpetrator's perspective. Let's look at this from the chilling perspective of the people actually causing the harm.
Here's the thing. Nobody really thinks they are the bad guy in their own story. Psychologist Albert Bandura proposed a concept called moral disengagement. Basically, when we view a target as less than human, our normal moral self-sanctions just shut down. Dehumanization essentially releases the parking brake on our morality. It completely removes victims from our sphere of justice and compassion, which effectively erases any guilt the perpetrator might feel. It's terrifying, but it explains so much about human history.
And that brings us to a really profound paradox pointed out by philosopher David Livingstone Smith. Think about it. Perpetrators often go out of their way to inflict maximum humiliation on their victims. But to humiliate someone, you absolutely have to know they have the capacity to feel shame, which is a purely human trait. So perpetrators actually know on a cognitive level that their victims are human, yet they constantly juggle that thought, backgrounding that humanity to assign them a subhuman essence. This creates some fascinating academic friction between psychology and philosophy. On the psychological side, researchers like Haslam argue dehumanization is a continuum, like a slider, where we just view someone as having less human essence. But on the philosophical side, Smith argues it's an absolute categorical switch. You are assigning a fundamentally subhuman essence to a human exterior. There's no middle ground. While academics debate the exact mechanics, the devastating real-world outcomes of both views are exactly the same.
Let's see how those devastating outcomes play out in Section 4, Escalation and Genocide.
You might be familiar with Gregory Stanton's classic model mapping the stages of genocide. Now, traditionally, dehumanization was placed squarely at stage 3, mainly seen as a tool of overt propaganda. But recent scientific evidence tells a much darker story. The mechanics of dehumanization don't just sit in one stage. They're actually the engine driving this entire process of escalation forward. It literally permeates every single stage. In the pre-conflict phase, we see these implicit biases taking root. During escalation, moral exclusion builds popular support for harsh segregation. When it comes to active harm, moral disengagement releases those psychological brakes we just talked about. And shockingly, even post-harm, dehumanization is used to rationalize the violence and reduce collective guilt.
For example, studies on the Bosnian War show perpetrators actively claiming victims weren't fully human anyway, just to avoid taking responsibility.
Okay, Section 5, Politics and Everyday Hostility. Because, before we assume this is only historical, let's look at today.
Take a look at the number 100. This represents the absolute pinnacle of the ascent of man's scale, which is a direct psychological measurement tool. Prepare to be shocked. In modern times, a lot of people will openly and explicitly rate opposing political groups as literally less evolutionarily developed than themselves, giving them scores way below 100. This is not just a metaphor. It is a literal denial of evolutionary humanity applied directly to everyday political opponents.
And this explicit hostility fuels something called meta-dehumanization. We saw this heavily in modern politics, like during the 2016 US primaries. Meta-dehumanization is that sudden realization, or even just the feeling, that an opposing group doesn't see you as fully human. And wow, does it create a vicious cycle. When a group feels dehumanized, they are infinitely more likely to respond with intense cyber-dehumanization on social media, endorse hostile actions, and completely shut down any chance of a civil political dialogue. The hostility just feeds on itself.
So, how do we fix this? Section 6, Repairing Intergroup Relations.
Thankfully, the academic synthesis provides us with some incredibly strong evidence-based methods for repair once the open hostility stops. First up, we have to recognize our own infrahumanization. We need to catch ourselves when we implicitly reserve complex emotions just for our in-group. Second, building empathy is non-negotiable. Look at the Protestant and Catholic reconciliation in Northern Ireland. Reattributing full emotional and mental capacities to historical adversaries was an absolute prerequisite for forgiveness. And finally, the ultimate game changer, meta-humanization. If you actively and publicly demonstrate to an out-group that you respect their full humanity, you can rapidly disarm those psychological barriers and significantly reduce reciprocal prejudice.
So, what does this all mean for us? Dehumanization isn't just about extreme wartime propaganda. It's the everyday psychology of who we treat like an unfeeling machine and who we treat like an unthinking animal. I want to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on. In your own life, which individuals, social groups, or political opponents are falling victim to your subtle biases? Recognizing that is the very first step to building a better, more human world. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.